This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van New Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. My guest today is a professor of modern Jewish history at the University of Cincinnati and the editor of a new book entitled The Essential Hayim Greenberg, Essays and Addresses on Jewish Culture, Socialism and Zionism. It was recently published by Alabama University Press. Dr. Mark Rader, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So when Hayim Greenberg, the great Jewish-American public intellectual, died in 1953, he was lauded both in America and Israel as one of the greatest of his generation. And my question to you is, why did I never hear about him until I came across your book?
Part of the reason may be that Hayim Greenberg was a figure who was celebrated in his own time, but because he was also above the fray in many ways in terms of the political scene, and declined a few opportunities in his lifetime to be involved in politics in a way that would have situated him in the newly established Israeli government or previously in various areas of the Jewish agency. He was someone that didn't actually build up a kind of political base of his own. He was well known in the States for his editorial activity with the Jewish Frontier and being active with the American section of the Jewish agency, but he wasn't someone that tried to bolster his own political career.
So it was just predominantly his personality or unassuming personality?
Well, I think he was a very modest and reserved person. He was also very unassuming.
Mm-hmm. But he was incredibly prolific and wrote a lot with a view to influence people, especially in favor of Zionism. What was he driven by?
So Hayim Greenberg comes from an Eastern European Jewish background. His youth is spent in Russia, and then he spends some of his young adulthood in Berlin, and then he travels to Palestine, and then he comes to the States, and he's back and forth between the States and Europe and Palestine numerous times in the 1930s and until the war erupts. And then thereafter, in the last few years of his life, he also does a lot of traveling back and forth. He was someone that was very active in cultural Zionist affairs. He was sent to the U.S. actually by the Zionist organization to help develop and further Zionist activity.
That was in the 1920s,
This
right?
is in the early 1920s. And he very quickly becomes involved, especially among the Yiddish-speaking immigrant communities, in a variety of editing and speaking and kind of political activities. He's asked to be the editor of the Yiddischer Kämpfer, which was really kind of a party organ of the labor Zionist movement in the U.S. It had been edited previously by Nachman Sirkin and by Ber Borochov when Borochov was in the States during the course of World War I. And at a certain point, with the rise of an English-speaking second generation, as it were, community of Jews, the offspring of Jewish immigrants, there's interest in creating an English language journal. And Greenberg is the obvious person to turn to in labor Zionist circles, and he becomes the editor of a new publication called Jewish Frontier. Mm-hmm. And that is in 1934.
Right. So what was the state of Zionism in general in America, and especially labor Zionism, when he came here and started being active in it? And to what extent, I know that there can't be a definite answer to that, but to what extent can you attribute the development of labor Zionism within the Jewish American discourse to him?
So he's certainly influential and central to what's going on in terms of labor Zionist discourse, both in the States and more broadly in Europe and Palestine and later Israel. He's taken very seriously by the other major figures in the labor Zionist movement and Zionism generally. When he arrives just following World War I in the U.S., this is a period of great change in terms of the American Jewish scene and attitudes towards Zionism. The Balfour Declaration had been formally approved and supported by Woodrow Wilson already in 1918, and there was a whole kind of fever of enthusiasm that had developed in the subsequent couple of years. And it's on kind of the heels of that Greenberg arrives in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So he is someone that jumps right into the thick of things. But he's always most involved in writing projects and speaking. He's not someone that wants to be a party functionary or has political ambitions to be, the head of the party or somehow to capture political position. He's very invested in Zionism as an intellectual project as well as a political project. And he believes in the vitality of the American Jewish scene as much as he's committed to the question of Zionism. He believes in the diaspora. So this is kind of an interesting tension.
Exactly, especially considering that he was a labor Zionist.
Right.
And, one of the tenets of labor Zionism was really to come to, this pragmatic horizon to go to Israel, make Aliyah, and, contribute to the construction of the state.
Yes.
How did he address that tension?
So Greenberg is of a piece with other figures like Beryl Katznelson or Nachman Sirkin, who subscribe to a voluntaristic sense of Zionism's potential, and who believe that essentially creating a new Jewish society in Palestine was not automatic, but that to the extent that it would be productive and self-sustaining, it should be created along socially just, ethical lines, and that this was a voluntary kind of an effort. But he's not ever, actually, among this group of like-minded thinkers, someone that abides by the notion of shlilat galut, the negation of the exile. He has a very kind of philosophical attitude toward the riches of Jewish tradition and of Jewish culture, and he believes and understands and speaks in a language that's, very much like the other major Zionist figures of the day, but where he is perhaps significantly different from them is in his sense that there is a vitality in the diaspora that ought to be preserved, it ought to be sustained, it ought to be nurtured, and that Israel and Zionism is at the center of this. He has this very interesting kind of piece that he delivers at a Zionist Congress after the State of Israel is created, in which he speaks about the notion that all roads in Jewish life lead to Eretz Israel. And I think that was really the guiding principle of his life's work from a very young age, until the very end.
He did spend some time in Palestine,
He spent lots of time in Palestine and then in Israel. He would go for extended periods and visits, on behalf of his Zionist activities and Zionist affairs. He was, I actually remember speaking to Aaron Appelfeld about Hayim Greenberg several years ago here at Brandeis when I was a graduate student.
Okay.
Yeah, and Appelfeld is a novelist. And he was being very helpful to me in some early work that I was doing that related to Greenberg. And he said, I remember Greenberg in the cafes in Tel Aviv holding court with Shlomo Grzezynski and other figures who were involved in the literary and cultural scene. And people understood and appreciated Greenberg's rich sense of connection with the development of life in Palestine and early Israel, and they took him very seriously. So
and how contentious was his favorable view of the diaspora within his Zionist circles in the Yishuv?
Well, there he had certainly a kind of a friendly, contentious or debate of sorts that was sustained over the course of many decades with several people. So, for instance, Zalman Rubishov, Shazar, right, who later becomes the president of Israel, is a close friend of Greenberg's. And I don't have any records of any debates. Actually, Greenberg's personal papers were thrown out by his widow after he died. She had apparently no appreciation of what was there, she and her son. And I've traced this over the course of a number of years, and I've been able to corroborate the story by talking to old-timers in the labor Zionist movement in the States who remembered Greenberg and remembered the days after his funeral and so on. But in any case, Shazar, writes about Greenberg in different places, and he laments Greenberg's decision to remain in the diaspora, and one has a strong sense of this kind of divide between that kind of true belief, a core belief as it were, in terms of the idea of the negation of the exile and the notion that only in Eretz Israel can one live an authentic Jewish life. And on the other hand, Greenberg, who argued that, in a sense, it is all part of a continuum and that Israel is absolutely central, and the anchor for Zionism, Palestine, Israel, but that Jewish life is vital over the course of many centuries in the diaspora, and it ought to be appreciated and it ought to be embraced.
So he was, in a sense, a precursor to the current form of Zionism that we see today.
Well, in many respects, I think that's partly why some of his writings are timeless. I wouldn't say that all of them are. I think he was a brilliant stylist and a wonderful writer, and his work is so fluid and so captivating.
In many languages, right?
In many languages. He was really multilingual. Russian, German, Yiddish, Hebrew, English, and Spanish, actually, a little bit of Spanish. But across the range of his writings, one finds references to Russian literature and European philosophy and music and art and contemporary politics and so on and so forth. But there are some timeless elements, including this notion that his appreciation in particular for what America represents in terms of a new idea of a Jewish diaspora as compared to Europe, let's say, or the Jews of the Islamic world, was something that was, and I think here there's a bias, a kind of a Western bias, but not one that's militant in some kind of a sense, that there was some kind of relationship between modernity and the West that was most fully represented in terms of a set of American possibilities that commended also the possibility of a new way of developing a diaspora Jewish existence that would be vital and thriving and meaningful and so on.
So he was very influential in Zionist circles in America, but they were still rather at a minority position at the time, right? To what extent did Greenberg's work permeate the larger Jewish community? Was he really, forced to be reckoned with within Jewish American intellectuals?
I think he was. Other figures took him very seriously, and he had extended relationships, as it were, kind of conversations and communications with figures across the broad range of American society and American Jewish life. And one sees that in Jewish Frontier, as well as in a number of other kinds of venues where Greenberg participated in discussions and debates. But even in Jewish Frontier, you find in the 1930s and 40s that Greenberg is inviting non-Zionist and anti-Zionist, but not in the sense of hostile to Zionism necessarily, figures to participate in debates and discussions in the pages of Jewish Frontier, as well as some of the most outstanding American intellectuals of the time, Charles Beard and Horace Callan, and so on. So
what about the great Zionist leaders in America at the time? Thinking about Abigail Silver and Stephen Wise. Were there any fault lines? How did they differ from one another? Were they on the same page on what?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. There was a period of time in the 1940s when the American Zionist Emergency Council, which emerges during the war, was riven with conflict over what the American Jewish response ought to be in terms of questions of relief and rescue and post-war Jewish reconstruction. And Abigail Silver and Stephen Wise, who are, kind of like oil and water. Wise is the elder, Silver is the younger, and they represent, not unlike Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, a kind of change of guard in terms of a generational transition. And that happens in the 1940s. And interestingly, Greenberg is something of a mediator here. So there's a period of time when, in the context of the American Zionist Emergency Council, these two figures are at loggerheads, and it's a major event in American Jewish life. And Greenberg is brought in to be, on a temporary basis, kind of a chair of the American Zionist Emergency Council, so as to try to mollify and tamp down some of this antagonism, which has to do with real politics around the pace of these types of activities.
So the antagonism wasn't strictly down to their personalities. They had really substantial disagreements over...
Well, between Silver and Wise, it was partly personality-driven and partly substantial. I would say it had more to do with substance, but the personality accentuated things. And Greenberg was a very warm, even-tempered type of personality who had the possibility of sustaining meaningful working and personal relationships with both Wise and Silver and plenty of others.
But so how did they differ? I mean, to which pole did he migrate?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. So I think part of what Greenberg represents, and this goes back to an earlier point that you alluded to, is that in the U.S., labor Zionism was never numerically significant. But because of the strength and importance of the labor movement in Palestine, there was a kind of disproportionate influence that labor Zionism had in the context of the American Jewish political scene. Now, it's also true that the labor Zionists when there were elections to World Zionist Congresses and so on, from 1935 into the 50s, really, won very large slates of electors that enabled them to go as an American delegation to these congresses with real strength. But the mainstream Zionists and Hadassah and so on were always much more sizable and much more successful in terms of raising funds. So part of what I'm describing here in terms of this like wise silver break is that there's the personality of Greenberg, who is a moderating figure. Then there's also the fact that he represents the dominance or hegemony of the labor movement in Palestine and in world Zionist affairs. But then I think there also is an element in which his personal relationship with these figures also enables him to play a role that someone else could not necessarily have done.
What about the leaders of labor Zionism in Palestine? So did Ben-Gurion see him as like his point man in America? Was he really the go-to person when it came to labor Zionism?
I think that might be overstating it. I think that he was someone that Ben-Gurion had well, Ben-Gurion, of course, is a very complicated personality, but Ben-Gurion had a strong relationship with him, as did Ben-Zvi. His relationships, in terms of Greenberg's, that is, in terms of these figures, I think were especially close with Ben-Zvi and Shazar and Golda Meir. And I think, he had a warm, friendly relationship with Ben-Gurion. And when he died, Ben-Gurion, said all of the right things in terms of acknowledging the friendship and so on. But he wasn't considered a kind of a rival or a figure that would necessarily carry water at the same time for someone like Ben-Gurion.
Right.
So it's interesting. I think Ben-Gurion thought of Greenberg in the way that he might have regarded someone like Bialik, really, as kind of above the fray, aligned with the labor Zionist idea. In fact, Greenberg, of course, is more of a labor Zionist than Bialik is, but not necessarily joined at the hip with the party apparatus, either in Palestine or previously in Europe.
Interesting. The scope of his work was astonishingly broad. I mean, he commented on really many aspects of, modern Jewish life in America and beyond. Would you say that still, at the end of the day, Zionism was really the featured most prominently in his outlook, in his work?
I would think so. That seems fair to me.
What can you tell us about the other things that preoccupied him?
Well, he has a very interesting correspondence with Gandhi about the nature of modernity and the place of pacifism, and this is in the midst of World War II. And Greenberg himself underwent a change from being a pacifist to being someone that cautiously and reluctantly accepted the need for a militant posture in terms of self-defense.
Was he a pacifist in the wake of the First World War? Just
yes,
like so many of his generation.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. But he is alarmed when there's a correspondence that also, Gandhi had this correspondence with several interesting Jewish figures, most significant among them Martin Buber, and Gandhi makes this statement about the need for Jews to practice nonviolence in Nazi Germany, and Greenberg, who's already been an admirer of Gandhi and had something of a correspondence with him, invites Gandhi to publish a piece in Jewish Frontier and then offers a rejoinder in which he says, we are asked to be superhuman under the threat of the Nazi regime. And this is, a totally untenable position. And that really, I think, is the moment where his shift from a pacifist stance to the need for self-defense crystallizes. So that's one area. He has his writings. He's very interested in Freud and the question of psychoanalysis. He's deeply interested in the American political scene, and he writes about the kind of travails of liberalism and socialism and social democratic positions in the U.S. arena. He's someone that's very early on, and it's quite interesting, I think, interested in the question of the rights of Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. So it's really a very broad-ranging figure.
Yeah. So being this towering intellectual for such a long time, in such critical periods, why has it been all but forgotten?
It's such an interesting question. It's something that I wrestled with in pulling the book together. There was a historian, Lloyd Gartner, who talked about figures like this disappearing down the memory hole, instead of being accorded the kind of place in the historical record that they rightly deserve. I think there probably are a few reasons in terms of Greenberg why this was the case. I think that because, as I mentioned at the outset, he wasn't someone that tried to create a kind of political post for himself. So he wasn't a party guy, he wasn't a functionary, he wasn't worried about attaining power. So that's one element to it, I think. I think he also was someone who operated in the interstices of lots of different groups and was comfortable with the idea of complexity and flexibility. And in an era that prized kind of true belief, either in Zionism or the idea that, America's home to American Jews, he was someone that was straddling a lot of different arenas. And I don't think that complexity necessarily worked in his favor in terms of endearing him beyond the fact that he was, an interesting figure and so on, but kind of earning him a place in the institutions that were emerging in the 1940s and 50s in Israel or in America. Mm-hmm. And I think he's also part of a passing generation in terms of the question of Yiddish-speaking Jews in the American scene. So there's the disappearance not only of someone like Greenberg down the memory hole, but also other major figures like Abe Kahan, who was the editor of the Vorwärts, the daily Jewish forward, which was such an important institution in American Jewish life. So the passing of that Yiddish-speaking generation was part of this. And then, finally, I think that there's this question of a kind of a collective amnesia on the part of American Jews, and maybe more generally, the Jewish world. Who do we think of as leaders, and who do we prize in terms of having been significant in the development of our communal institutions or our political organizations, or helping to achieve important advances, whether it's in terms of the Zionist project or sustaining Jewish life generally. And it's unfortunate, but I just think that's part of what's happened.
Do you hope that your book will pull him out of that memory hole?
Well, I certainly hope so. I'm not under any illusions that this book is somehow the silver bullet, but I hope that it restores Greenberg to the arena of Jewish public discourse in some measure. And I hope that my colleagues will take the book seriously and consider Greenberg as one of these kind of interesting, important figures that ought to be revisited.
Okay.
Yeah.
On this note, Dr. Mark Rader, a professor of modern Jewish history at the University of Cincinnati and the editor of the new book, The Essential Hayim Greenberg Essays and Addresses on Jewish Culture, Socialism and Zionism. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shandlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on Facebook as well as on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.